All right, last week we spent all of our time in the introductory portion looking at the matter of what he called deconstructionists, which is what I said is the same thing in more modern language as a deconstructionist, which in hermeneutical or interpretive language means to take a text and break it down to its most basic components, which obviously there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I think any good interpretation wants to understand the very nature of the text and the circumstances out of which that text is written. Let me just give you a quick example. You may or may not remember this. It's fresh on my mind for a couple of reasons, but we studied the book on why do people not see the Bible alike. You remember back in 2017, and Aaron Allsbrook came and held a meeting for us, and that was our theme: why do people not see the Bible alike? And it was based on a book by J. Ridley Stroop, and so I probably enjoyed teaching that book more than any book that we've ever studied in all of my time here. I mean, I really enjoyed that book. I've probably given away a dozen copies of that book. I probably have a half a dozen copies at the house right now of that book. I just think it's an incredible work. But the reason is I gave my in-laws a copy when we went up to St. Louis last week. But I failed to explain to them that when they're reading that book, they're going to find repeated references to the phrase carnal warfare. Carnal warfare. And it seemed to me at that time when we were studying the book that Stroop was a pacifist. Now, that's in and of itself is neither here nor there, except for the fact that the book was written in 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II. And so, in other words, you say, well, why would this guy keep bringing up the subject of carnal warfare as if it's some type of issue in the brotherhood? Well, in 1949 it was. Because there were a lot of faithful Christians who refused to fight, although others would serve in a non-combat capacity. But the point is that when you're reading that book, you need to understand the circumstances under which Stroop had researched and written that book. And so the same thing goes with the New Testament. We want to understand the Bible in the construct in the context in which it was written. Except for the fact that now the idea of deconstructionism means to take a thing apart and put it back together the way you want it. And that's the way that so many people are approaching the Scriptures today. And by the way, that's the same way people approach in the political realm the attitude toward the Constitution of the United States. People want to talk about the Constitution of the United States, and they refer to it as it's a living document. It grows and it expands, and it has to be interpreted in light of current circumstances, which essentially says it doesn't mean anything. If what it means changes based on the external circumstances, then it's worthless as a document. And the same thing goes for the Bible. If the Bible doesn't teach, concrete, incontrovertible truths, then the Bible doesn't teach anything at all. And so this attitude of deconstruction is prevalent in our I'll call it political. I don't know that's necessarily political, but in the interpretive view of the Constitution, and also it's carried over into the view of how to interpret the Bible. When I was first getting started in ministry back in the early 90s, there was this idea that was being floated around and propagated in our brotherhood by those that are to the far left, that the Bible is only a love letter and it is not a legal document. It was called love letter versus law. It was kind of the idea, and that the Bible wasn't really a law; it was really a love letter from God, which meant that what? if there's no law, then however you interpret whatever is there is how it works for you. But the next person may read it and take a completely different view of it. But that also works for them, because God's not concerned with law. It's really just a love letter. Ma'am? Oh yeah, nothing would be binding. Every man becomes a law to himself. And so this deconstructionist idea, carried over in the brotherhood, in the idea that the Bible really didn't contain any law. It was more just a love letter from God to reaffirm how much God loves us, and then we were just to take that and do with it as we please. Now, of course, the overarching theme of the last part of this book has been anarchy. And anarchy is, in a nutshell, the rejection of an absolute rule of law. Now, we use the word anarchy in a lot of different contexts, mostly just to describe people when they're out of control. But in its essence, anarchy is when there is no absolute rule of law, anything goes. Anything goes. And so, and by the way, are we not seeing that in our current society? That there is the rejection of any absolute rule of law. And by the way, when not only is there anarchy when there is no respect for the law, there is anarchy when the law does not do what it was supposed to do. For example, this is just a very simple example. If no one in Marion County received a speeding ticket for about 5 years, and you never saw anybody pulled over on the highway, and you never saw a patrolman, parked down there close to what we call the new bridge down here, hiding behind the railing, or hiding behind the pine trees over here in the church parking lot. If you never saw that for about 5 years, what do you think would happen to the rate of speed that people drive? What do you think would happen? It would increase, and it would probably increase a lot. I'll give you another example. Try driving around 285 in Atlanta, around the south side, by any time. It's anarchy. Because if you're not doing 85 or 100, you better stay out of the two left lanes. If you're not running 85 or 100, you better stay out of if you want to run 80, you better run in the left lane or like the middle lane. But you don't want to get any farther left than that. Why? Because there's a million people driving, and there's very little way of catching anybody, right? And so what do people do? I know I'm not going to get caught, so what? I just drive as fast as I want. And that's what they do. Now that's a very limited illustration of how anarchy is constituted. When people burn buildings to the ground, take over police stations, set fires everywhere, and the police just stand there and watch it, what's the result of that? Anarchy. When people walk down the street busting out windows, by the way, they don't even have to be rioting now. They just walk into stores. They just walk into stores and carry stuff out now. And they add it up on a calculator on their cell phone, because if it's less than $1,000, they can't be arrested for it. So they add up what they're stealing and walk out the door with it. What is that? That is anarchy. That's anarchy. Now, that same attitude can become prevalent in the church when difficulties in the church, either by individuals or groups of individuals, are not dealt with. As Brother Frank Chesser said, I believe it was in I got a sermon he preached on the indestructible kingdom. It was preached in 93 at the Faulkner Lectures. One of the greatest sermons I ever heard. Undoubtedly one of the greatest sermons I ever heard. But he made the statement. He said, you take discipline out of the school, basically, and the inmates will run the asylum. He said, when you take discipline out of the church, he said, what you end up with is a shrug of the shoulder attitude towards sin. In other words, when there's no checks and balances, so to speak. In other words, when there's no one to check you, your attitude towards sin changes. And so this whole idea of anarchy is one that needs to be understood. I mean, let me just take this thing a little bit closer to home. How much authority does an eldership or congregation have over an individual that doesn't attend the services of the church? How much authority? None, really, but yet there is some authority, right? In other words, does an eldership in the church have the right and the authority to correct those that are wayward? They do. Now, if the eldership in the church does not correct those that are wayward, what happens? That's right. Ann says everybody starts acting up. Which that's just the old country way of saying it. But what happens is that, first of all, the people that are unfaithful will not come back. And then others who may be, let's just say on a scale of 1 to 10, whose faith is starting to weaken, their dedication is starting to weaken, then they're more likely to fall away, because why not? Why not? I preached a sermon, and I'm not impugning anybody, and I'm not going to say where I preached it, but I preached a sermon, recently, and over the course of that sermon, and I didn't think anything in the world about it. But I think I mentioned hell 7 times in that sermon. And I wasn't preaching about hell. I was just talking about what happens to people that are unfaithful, or the fact that, that hell is real and we need to be mindful of that. And you would not believe how many people came up to me afterwards and said, we haven't heard anybody even mention the word hell. We can't even remember the last time we heard hell being mentioned. I'm like, are you kidding me? And they said, they're like, say, man, you really preached. Like, no, if I've got something to say and hell's involved, I'm just going to say it. It's not like I'm preaching on hell any more than I'm preaching about Jesus or any other Bible subject that might come up during the course of my sermon. But the fact that they had not heard a sermon on hell or any reference to hell. So what about the people, say this right. Some people responded positively to that, even though I wasn't intentionally trying to do anything along those lines. I suspect that there may be some people who reacted negatively to that. And then there probably is a larger group, larger than both spectrums, in the middle that probably just didn't think anything about it at all. And that's what happens. That's what happens when, for example, when the whole counsel of God's not taught, when the whole counsel of God's not practiced, when people are not corrected, when they are in error. So open your Bibles to the book of 2 Peter chapter 2, thinking about anarchy. 2 Peter chapter 2. And we're going to pick up in verse number 12, and we're going to read through verse number 19. Now, I'm reading this in the context of correction, okay, versus anarchy. In Hebrews chapter 12, the Hebrews writer says, beginning in verse 5, talking about whom the Lord loves, he corrects and disciplines all of his children that he receives. And in that context it says, now no discipline at the time seems pleasurable. You know, nobody ever got their tail tore up by their mama or dad and said, "Thank you, sir, may I have another?" Right? I mean, it's the discipline that we receive. And I can say this because now we're the old people's class, because there's a young people's class over here, which means under 50. But here comes one that's almost too old. We red-shirted him. What was I talking about? Discipline. There you go. Nobody ever enjoyed discipline when they received it. But now that we're all old enough, and by the way, we don't have to be as old as we are now to look back and appreciate it, right? In other words, no discipline is present, no discipline is enjoyed when it's received at the time. But the text says later it brings a fruit of peace and righteousness. In other words, what is uncomfortable now makes my life better later. All right. Now, what Peter's going to be talking about here in 2 Peter 2 is basically the preaching of anarchy. The preaching of anarchy. It says, but these, talking about false teachers, like natural brute beasts made to be caught and destroyed, speak evil of the things they do not understand, and will utterly perish in their own corruption, and will receive the wages of unrighteousness as those who count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime. They are spots and blemishes, carousing in their own deceptions, while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery that cannot cease from sin, enticing unstable souls. They have a heart trained in covetous practices. They are accursed children. They have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he was rebuked for his iniquity. A dumb donkey speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. And these are wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. For when they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lusts of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in terror. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. Now, the writer here, Peter, is saying that these false teachers, first of all, they speak about things they really don't know about. In other words, they criticize things that they don't know anything about. But then he goes on to say that they will receive the reward of their error. But then he goes on to say in verse number 13, it says, they're running with you, but they're actually trying to deceive you. It says they're full of deception while they feast with you. In other words, they're in here mingling. They're in here mingling with you, but their intent is not to be your friend. Their intent is to deceive you with their error. And then you get to verse 18. Verse 17. But they're wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest. You know, you think about, well, TV evangelists and politicians probably do this more than anything. They use these great big words and phrases and all these things to make people feel good, but really what they've said is nothing but a bunch of hot air. Does that make sense? In other words, they make these great statements using these broad platitudes that make people feel good about the politician or about themselves or about the direction that things are going. But really what they've said doesn't amount to a hill of beans. There's no substance behind it. It just sounds good. And so Peter describes them as wells without water. Clouds carried by a tempest. They're empty, he says. They speak, verse 18, great swelling words of emptiness. They allure through the lust of the flesh. They promise liberty, but they themselves are slaves to corruption. Think about this. Here's how it might work. For a brief time, people might like the idea of casting off all restraint. In other words, anarchy. For a brief time, they might like the idea of casting off all restraint. I can use Shannon, or I can use Stephanie as an example. What if you told one of your classes at some point, y'all just do whatever you want. I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to say a thing to anybody. Or I might even leave the classroom and just leave y'all to your own device. Whatever you want to do is fine. All right, what's the initial response to that? Yeah! That's what we've been waiting on. All right, but how long does that last? In other words, how long does that euphoria last before somebody decides, hey, this is not a good idea? Because people left to their own devices will hurt other people and eventually hurt themselves. Now look, kids are not wise enough, kids are generally not wise enough to figure out what the end game of that is. What's the long-term effect. But the point is, initially they think, oh man, this is great. We can do whatever we want. I'm going to get my phone out. I'm going to chew some gum. I'm going to whatever. But after a while, it's not going to be that great. In fact, I'd guess in a classroom situation, Stephanie taught 6th grade when she retired, and Rhonda teaches 6th grade. Knowing that bunch, I'm going to guess that there's going to be conflict in less than 5 minutes. In other words, the idea of casting off all restraint sounds great to everybody, but I'm going to guess in less than 5 minutes, it's not going to be going that well for some of them. Or maybe most of them. All right? So what Peter's saying is, these false teachers come in and they just cast off the idea of restraint. And by the way, that can be appealing to adults as well, right? But after a very short time, we're going to figure out that's not the way I want to live. That's not the town. I don't want to live in a town that doesn't have policemen. I don't want to live in a county that doesn't have a sheriff's department, right? I don't want to live in a state that lacks state troopers or the ABI or nobody wants to live in those places. So the idea at first is that casting off all restraint is a great idea, but after about 5 minutes, when somebody kicks your door down and takes all your stuff, then it's not that great. Now, on page 130 and 131, John, the writer John Kakelman, makes a reference to the French Revolution and a time which was it's debatable how long what was known as the Terror lasted. Some think it lasted about 5 years, from 1789 to about 1794. I think most people believe it was about 1793 to 1794, the intensity of what was known as the Reign of Terror, or shortened it was called the Terror. What happened? Well, that's when Marie Antoinette lost her head. Over the course of about a year, almost 17,000 people were executed. 10,000 more people died in prison without being charged or without any type of a due process. In other words, this revolution gave way to a period of anarchy. But according to this historian, the terror and the anarchy was not a result of people being poor. It was the matter of that people rejected the rule of authority. And they accepted every, well, look on top of page 131. Beginning in the first full paragraph where it begins with the word one. It says, with regard to the terror, beginning with it is ironic. It is ironic that of all countries in Europe, France was the only one that could have had a revolution. Not because she groaned under the lash of tyranny, but on the contrary, because she tolerated and invited every conceivable dissension and heresy, restlessness, a passion for novelty, and the pursuit of excitement were everywhere in the air. They were the fruits of idleness and leisure, not of poverty. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. That, our world is filled with poverty, right? There are nations, there are impoverished nations all around the globe. And yet poverty is rarely, if ever, the cause of revolution. The rejection of authority is the cause of revolution. And this writer, whose last name is Lomas, I think, and I didn't look up the book name, and I'll do that later. But he says, when people just start accepting everything, and there is no, in other words, there is no objective truth, there is no objective rule of law or authority, so you're ripe for revolution. Let me ask you a question. Of all the nations, primary nations on the planet right now that are ripe for revolution, who do you think's at the top of the list? Wade Ramsey? Huh? We are. This nation is ripe for revolution. China is not ripe for revolution. Russia is not ripe for revolution. England gave up objective truth years and years ago. They're not ripe for revolution. Our country is ripe for revolution. From both sides. Because, look, I read what's going on in the country, and I read what's being said. Those that are the anarchists in our country, their philosophies and what they want is following the pattern of Hitler, Mao, Stalin, all of the Marxists of the 20th century that led to the deaths of 100 million people. Their philosophy, the leftist anarchists in our country, their philosophy matches that of those who killed 100 million people in the 20th century. Look, the country folks with their guns are not the threat to America. We're not the threat to America. The people that have cast off all restraint are the threat to America. The people that burn cities down are a threat to America. The people that say we don't need any police are a threat to America. The people that say that men can be women and women can be men are a threat to America. Those are the people that are a threat to America. They're going to be the cause of revolution, but what's going to end up happening, in my opinion, all right, is that there's going to be enough folks that still believe, as old saying, in God, family, and country, that eventually they're going to get a bait of it, and this thing's going to go sideways. I really believe that. And I believe it'll happen in my life. If I live a lifetime of the average person, I believe we're going to see armed conflict among the people. Why? Because there's a significant portion of our country that has cast off all restraint. And the people that are in charge of keeping us safe have turned a blind eye to it. And actually encouraged it. And so, with that in mind, again, these attitudes are prevalent in the country, But these attitudes are also making their way into the church. Just by way of example. By the way, in light of study, if there's one thing that I really benefited from preparing all this, is that it occurred to me, my preaching has gotten away from the fundamentals. In the sense that the very fundamental truths of the church. In other words, I'm trying to preach the whole counsel of God, right? But I got to thinking, Todd, when's the last time you preached on instrumental music? When's the last time you preached on marriage, the home and marriage and divorce? By the way, I can tell you when those times are, and it's been at least 3 or 4 years. And that's too long. That's too long. Because our young people need to hear these things from the pulpit. And so I'm late in the game getting there, but my plan is, at least this year, to, on the first Sunday of every month, preach a first principle sermon. The first Sunday of every month to preach a first principle sermon. Now, this morning's sermon is not so much a first principle sermon, like I said, because I was already prepared before the idea came. But I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go back and preach some first principle sermons this year, and try to do that every year. We're gonna preach on instrumental music, on baptism, and once saved, always saved, and the nature of the church. Things that our young people really need to hear, and the things that make the church different from the rest of the religious world. There's no question. People are abandoning. California is losing people like crazy. They had a net loss the last 2 years of population because people are trying to get away. Listen, Marion County is getting full of people from the West Coast. California, Oregon, Washington State, because they said it's unlivable. It's unlivable. We can't live there anymore. And we've got to get away. And a lot of these people have families. They have kids. And they're coming here because they understand that there's at least some semblance of respect and order. But those of us that have lived here for a long time understand it's still not what it used to be. Yeah. I mean, people are buying property in this county sight unseen. Sight unseen. Sir? Yeah. Yeah. People are flocking to the... People are abandoning anarchy. They are and here's the thing. The more that kind of thing happens, the more polarized the Southeast becomes from other parts. In other words, the more good people leave the West Coast and come to the Southeast, the more polarized those two groups will become, because the West Coast is losing their salt and their light. If I might use a biblical reference, right? In other words, the people that are trying to be salt and light have found those places to be unlivable. I can't raise my kids here. I got to get out of here. So what happens? Then the left just gets, in other words, the more right-leaning people leave left-leaning areas, the more left-leaning it becomes. And that's why, like I said, I think that revolution is right here more than any. I don't think it's going to be tomorrow or next week or even 5 or 10 years. I just think that I'm 54 and I should live at least another 30 years if all goes well, and I'm liable to see it. That's what I'm saying. I hope I don't. I hope there's some kind of reversal, but I'm not hopeful, because nations rarely go that direction. States rarely go that direction. All right, let's go to lesson 12 next week. Don't forget, think about what we want to do with this class. You got a week or so to think about it. And I don't need anything specific. If you just give me some ideas, but if you want to get back to a textual study, and you've got a book in mind, or you want to get back to a study of the epistle, look, I'm open because I don't have anything waiting in the wings for us to go from here. So I appreciate any help you give me on that.